Today, there are hundreds and thousands of available typefaces, so the choice of what typeface to use for a project can be overwhelming. There's no magic recipe for choosing type, but in this lecture, we'll look at some of the pragmatic considerations that may inform your choice. Next week, we'll move on to some more nuanced considerations. If you're choosing a typeface to set in text, you may want to start by considering legibility, how easy it is to distinguish one letter or word from the next. As I mentioned before, serif typefaces are conventionally seen as easier to read in text than sans serifs, because the serifs help visually define each baseline. If you're setting type at small sizes, say 8 points or below, you may want to look for a typeface with a large X height, like the one on the left here, so that the distinguishing features of the letter forms remain relatively big even when the type is set small. If you're choosing a typeface for the screen, X height is even more important, because at small sizes, pixels can blur the details of the type. Typefaces designed especially for the screen, like Georgia, have extra large X heights for this reason. When working for the screen, it's also a good idea to look for a typeface with an open aperture, like the one on the top here. This typeface has a wider opening in letters like the lowercase a, c, and e than the typeface on the bottom, so it avoids situations where parts of the letters can start to blur together at small sizes. But when considering legibility, it's also important to keep things in perspective. Legibility is subjective, and the fact is that typefaces with familiar forms are easier to read, and those with less familiar forms are harder work. Another practical consideration in choosing type is always availability. Typefaces cost money, some several $1,000s, and as a designer, you'll probably be working within a budget. If you're designing for the web, availability is even more of a complicated issue. By default, web browsers display type by calling up fonts from the user's computer, and most users are only likely to have a handful of so-called web-safe fonts on their computer. A workaround for designers is to use typefaces hosted externally, either by a free service like Google Fonts, or from a subscription service like Typekit. A final option is to buy a full-blown web license for a typeface, but this can often be really expensive. If you're choosing more than one typeface for a project, you'll want to choose typefaces that go together well. And the trick to combining typefaces successfully is to balance contrast with consistency. Establish contrast by choosing typefaces that are stylistically distinct from one another, like these. Avoid choosing typefaces that are stylistically similar, like these. And remember that even though two typefaces may look quite different at large size, those differences may become invisible in text. To establish a through line of consistency, look for typefaces with similar proportions. Start by comparing the X height of the typefaces. Then compare the shapes of the letters, like the shapes of the O's and of the A's and G's. For a perfect match, consider choosing two typefaces that were designed specifically to go together. This is Scala and Scala Sans, which we'll look at in more detail next week. The pragmatic issues we've looked at here are only some of the considerations involved in choosing a typeface. The rest has to do with the subjective feel of the typeface, as it's often shaped by its history, uses, and associations. And that's what we're going to look at next week.